Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that everybody was able to join us today and for registering. My name is Kim Case. I'm the VP of Programming for ASLA Colorado and Wyoming. I am also supported on the programming and event planning side by Sarah Bonnequist, who is our president, as well as Audrey Sorensen, our president-elect, as well as Katie Bridges, Yvonne, a whole plethora of people who make these types of events happen. I wanted to first just see if my screen will move. Okay, there we go. I want to introduce Adam Carreau from Design Workshop. He is just a master in Rhino, as well as many other things. Adam will be facilitating this tutorial as well as April 4th tutorial. So this today's tutorial is a very basic introduction to Rhino, and our next tutorial will be a little bit more intermediate. A few just general housekeeping items before I do pass it over to Adam. If you have access to a Rhino license, Adam recommends just following along on that if you're able to have it open. Otherwise, if you don't, this will be recorded. We have a YouTube channel. We aren't quite YouTube famous yet, but we're hoping after this tutorial we will be. You can access it there. Questions we will try to address at the end. So if you want to type in any questions that you have in the chat, I will help Adam to track those, and we'll try to get to those at the end of the tutorial. And I did already mention Rhino Intermediate. I have the wrong date on there, April 4th. And lastly, just a plug, if you want to help facilitate a tutorial Tuesday, please reach out to me. I'll pull my email up at the end as well. Again, thanks everybody for joining. Adam, I'm gonna pass it over to you now.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Rhinoceros 3D beginner tutorial. This tutorial will kind of cover some modeling basics and the interface. There's a lot to cover in an hour and a half, so I will do my best to address the questions at the end. And if you do have Rhino, please do follow along. If you get lost, don't worry about it. It's recorded, so you can always go back to the video and kind of follow along at your own pace. Additionally, I will be sending out some helpful tutorials that I have utilized along the way that you can all follow along in between now and the next session to increase your Rhino abilities. So the agenda today, we're going to cover a number of things. The first being why model, the second being object types, so different objects and which ways you can model in Rhino. The third will be navigation with your mouse. The fourth will be the Rhino interface, so what you see when you open the program. And the fifth will go over kind of your modeling basics, what to start out with. Number 6 are some frequent commands that I find myself using all of the time. And if you want, you can take a snip of that or screenshot. And, you know, I always tell people to utilize YouTube. If you typed Rhino revolve into YouTube, you would have a great tutorial on how to use that command. And if we can get to it, we will model a play feature, but we'll see how far along we get today. So why model? Modeling is a great way to create a representation, a 3D representation of your design. It's a great way to sell your ideas to clients, as well as to evaluate your own design decisions and determine if things are appropriate or need tweaking. I find myself making models just to address and just to look at internally with my colleagues to really understand space and volume and scale. And it's, like I mentioned before, it's a great way to share your designs with your clients. That way they can give feedback, and you can adjust that feedback and adjust things as the project goes along. Another thing that Rhino is great for is detailing. If you kind of utilize best practices while modeling, it's really easy to go from a 3D model to 2D sections to 2D plans, which ultimately are the tools that will get something built in the real world. And I share this because, you know, utilizing standard I-beam sizes, steel sizes, structural steel sizes in your model will allow you to go directly from Rhino 3D into other programs like AutoCAD, where you can do your documentation. Of course, you're going to want to coordinate with your structural engineer on those steel sizes, but this is just a good way to go from model to detailing. If you spend the time to build something out, you know, completely, as if it was going to get built the next day, it's really easy to go from the 3D model to 2D sections, which can make it into your documents. So there's 6 different object types that Rhino uses to 3D model. The first being points. Those are just points in space. So they'll have an X, Y, and Z coordinate. I utilize points a lot when I am making meshes for topography. The next is curves. So those are, you know, a line or a curve in between 2 points. Curves are really what I utilize as the basis of 3D modeling. Surfaces are a 3D representation of a plane. So those control points that you can see will manipulate this surface. And I utilize surfaces when I'm doing kind of conceptual topography modeling. The next is solids, which are you know, extruded surfaces, so they have a volume. They're closed poly surfaces, and when you work with solids, you can easily go to a 3D printer or start to design volumes in the 3D model space. Sub D, I don't utilize very often. It's compared to as modeling with clay. So it's very good at product design, shoes, kitchenware, etc. I rarely use that in landscape architecture modeling. And the final is meshes. If you are familiar with SketchUp or Civil 3D, a lot of the 3D exports the 3D exports from those programs are meshes, which are a triangulation of a 3D object. And in Rhino, you can model in meshes. I use meshes when I'm doing highly detailed terrain modeling, and it's a good way to export from Rhino to other programs, such as SketchUp. So navigation, when I started college and started using Rhino, I always remembered people trying to model with their trackpads on their laptops. Do not do that. It is impossible. It will take so much longer. You're going to need a mouse when you're utilizing Rhinoceros 3D. So as you can see, the left mouse button selects, the center scroll wheel zooms in and out, and the right mouse button pans in 2D views and orbits in 3D views. So when you open up Rhino for the first time, it may look a little overwhelming, but this diagram is to show you that it's really not that complex, or it's not as complex as it looks. There's multiple ways to skin a cat, and in Rhino, there's 3 different ways to access commands, which you can see in red. The first being the drop-down toolbar at the top, the second being the command line, and the third being the icons with these various tabs. On the right side, this is your panels. So there's various panel tabs such as layers, properties, materials, named views. There's also a help bar, which I'll get into shortly. And on the bottom here in green, those are your drafting aids. So if you're familiar with CAD, there's similar aids such as Object Snap or OSnap, which allows you to snap to, the end, the point, the midpoint, the center of different objects. And we'll get into that very shortly. So the last thing I'm going to share in this presentation is modeling basics. So what I like to do when I 3D model is I will look at an object and I will break it down into its 2D lines that make up that 3D object. So as you can see in this concrete planter, those blue lines, those blue circles would be one way to model this 3D volume. Or if you're looking at that red dash line, that's kind of a half of a section profile of that planter, and that is another way that you could model this in 3D. So just as you're diving into the software and as you're starting to model different things, just remember to start out with the 2D lines that create the 3D object. All right, and with that, let's hop into Rhino. So as you can see, this is similar to the interface image I just shared earlier. You have your kind of file and edit, which is very similar to most programs. This allows you to open and save, import, kind of just your general file control. This is your edit. Control Z and Control Y, I use a ton. That's undo and redo. Also copy, paste, Control C, Control V, I utilize as well. And then here in the drop-down menu are various ways to access those commands. So as you can see, these are curves, which are your lines in between 2 points. As you can see, you can go to line, you can draw a single line, line segments, and this is similar to surfaces, sub D, solid. So these are all ways you can access commands. The next way to access a command is in this command bar here. So if I was to type in line, just to draw a line, you can see that it starts this command, and then you can follow the prompts in that command line. As you can see, it says start of line, and you can click, and then the end of line, you can click to complete. Another thing to note is that I'm going to go ahead and just draw a polyline. If you click spacebar or enter, that will end a command. So as you can see, that line just finished at that second point. So that's another thing to note. And as you're utilizing the command line, be sure to follow these prompts because if you can toggle these different components within that prompt, and it will ultimately change that command's function. So if I do that again, you can see persistent close is toggled on to yes. So I'm going to click no, and as you can see, it's not a closed polyline. By clicking C, you can close that polyline. So the third way to access commands like I just showed earlier, are going through these toolbars. As you can see, they have a little mouse icon. So if you were to click on the left, it would be a polyline, which is a line segmented by a number of points. And then if you click left, you can see that there's individual line segments that are not connected. So be aware that you can left and right click to toggle different commands. And also a thing to note is if you click this bottom drop down arrow, you can access a number of commands that you wouldn't be able to see unless you click that drop down menu. And there's multiple ways to do similar things. So right now here's a curve through control points, and as you can see, it's interpolating that curve through those points. But if I was to drop this menu down and click curve interpolate points, sorry, it will actually create that curve based on those points as opposed to those control points. So that's another way to access these commands. And if you start toggling through these top toolbars here, you'll notice that these commands will change. And this is similar to that drop down pull out menu. It's just they each get their own icon when you start going through these. So that kind of covers how to access the various commands in Rhino. The next thing we'll go over is this tool palettes. So as you can see, there's properties, layers. Layers I'm usually on 95% of the time. Then you have re-render, materials, named views. This I want to draw your attention to. It's this little help tab here, and this is nice because if you were interested in a command, you can go ahead and type it, and then it'll actually prompt you to what that toolbar is, how to utilize that toolbar, and it'll give you a little animation showing how to do that. So this is a great way just to familiarize yourself with commands that you may not know, and it's built into Rhino, so it's super easy to use when you're modeling. If you wanted to add more panels, there's a little settings or options cog over on the right here of the toolbar, and you can click it and you can add more things to your toolbar. You can also undock these if you want them to have their own space, or you can dock them adjacent to those tool palettes. If you wanted to bring them back in, you can pull and drag and you can put them back onto that toolbar. So that is your toolbars. Down here are kind of your drawing aids, which if you're familiar with CAD, this will sound very familiar, but we'll just go through a couple of them now. So if you go to grid snap, you can see that it snaps to all these different segments of your grid. If you toggle on ortho, it'll restrict your drawing to 90-degree angles. Planar, you can utilize in these views, and it'll draw on a 2D surface unless it's drafting or unless it's snapping to a 3D point. Smart track, OSnap, if you're familiar with CAD, is object snap, and that allows you to snap to different points in your model. So as you can see, I have end turned on here, and it will allow me to snap to an end. If I wanted to turn that off, you can see that it won't allow me to snap to that end. If you wanted to disable everything, you can just go ahead and click this button, and now there's no O snaps enabled. Again, delete on your keyboard is a good way to delete stuff you don't need. I usually model with my O snaps on all the time because it allows you to snap to things that you want to, as opposed to just kind of drawing in 3D space. Smart track relates to dimensioning. So if you have an object and you have smart track on and you're pulling dimension strings from it, it'll actually know that you want from the outside of the object to the outside of the object. So it would snap from kind of my cursor here to this cursor here. So that's good if you're putting kind of annotations on. Gumball I use all the time. It's such a cool tool. So as you can see, this is Gumball. It allows you to move your objects in a Z, in a Y, and in an X direction. It also allows you to scale if you click one of these circles. So you can see the circle in green, in red. And what that does is you can scale by a factor of 2, and then your circle just got twice as long in the Y axis. And if you did that on the red, it would get twice as wide on the red axis. Also, if you click these solid circles, it allows you to extrude your surface into a 3D object. So this is a cool tool. I use it all the time to move stuff. If I wanted to move this thing 10 feet in the Y direction or 10 units in the Y direction, you can just type it in and it'll automatically do that for you. I find that tool very helpful. Chord history, I'm not going to get into now. It's pretty complex, but as you kind of advance your Rhino knowledge, I would just advocate to check out a tutorial to see what that is, but I won't be covering that today. And then what you're seeing in this main area, these 4 screens, these are kind of your viewports. This is top of your 2D. Front is 2D, right is 2D, perspective is 3D. So if you hold down the right, you can pan in your top, front, and right view. If you hold down the right in perspective, you can orbit. Using the scroll wheel, you can zoom in and out in all of these viewports. So that is kind of your basic navigation in these 4. You can also change these if you wanted your perspective to be larger, but I usually just keep them at their defaults. So if within each of these viewports, there's different tabs. So I'm gonna just go ahead and make a simple box here just for explanation's sake. And as you can see, it's like a 2D wireframe of a 3D object. That's because these first 10 tabs here, if you click on the drop-down menu on the right side of that viewport, these are kind of your display tabs. So as you click through them, you can start to see that your viewport changes its display style. You know, I use shaded a lot, rendered, we'll get into shortly. Ghosted, you can start to see the kind of 2D lines that make up the 3D surface. This is nice selecting when you're designing very complex things. You know, there's a ton you can play around, technical, artistic, you know, pen starts to make it look more diagrammatic. Arctic is like it's made of foam. So those are kind of your drop down display styles. I'm going to keep it to shaded for now, but as you can see, there's other tools here. So you know, a lot of what I utilize this for a lot is to set view. So as you can see, you can set it to top, and it's just going to be the same thing as your top. it's generically set to perspective, but if you wanted to kind of export an isometric view, you can do that. And as you can see, it's got a nice ISO view. I'll do that one more time. And it's a good way to export kind of isometric views. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to perspective. So to enlarge one of these viewports to take up your entire screen, you can go ahead and click perspective twice, and it'll enlarge that window to fit your entire screen. You can utilize these tabs to toggle between the 4 views that you have set, and you can also add more views as desired. Also to note, in these 2D views, you can set different display options as well. And if you double click, it will take you back to the 4 window kind of view frame, which is, it's nice because it allows you to see things in the front, you know, top. So as you're modeling, you can utilize all of these windows to aid you in your 3D modeling. So with the basics of the interface covered, let's just go ahead and start utilizing some of these tools. So I showed you earlier that you can access a bunch of these different tools through these tabs. But as you can see, if you look at the curve tools and you go to the standard and you click your curve tools, those are the same tools that are displayed when you click your tab. It's just another click to get into them, which is that drop-down menu. So 95% of the time I am utilizing this tool palette if I'm selecting the icon. So let's start off with points. If I left click, I can make a single point, and that's just a 2D, or that's just a point in space. It's assigned an X, Y, and Z value, as you can see in this 3D view. And if I was to right click, I can just set multiple points. And as you can see in the prompt up here, it says press enter when done. And if you press spacebar or enter, it'll end the command. Another thing to note is if you press spacebar or enter again, it will just queue up the last used command. And as you can see, I'm just clicking with my left cursor, and that creates tons of points there. So, well, I'm gonna just kind of jump ahead here and just make a ton of different circles. I'm using spacebar to queue up the last used command. And this exercise will show you how to select objects. So if you have a bunch of objects and you want to just select stuff within the boundary of your selection box, you can left click and drag. And as you can see, it will only select objects within that box. If you started from the bottom right corner and went up, it will select everything that is touching the perimeter of that box, as well as everything that is in the inside of it. If you have a bunch of stuff selected and you want to select more, you can hold Shift, and that will start to allow you to select other objects. If you want to deselect objects, you can hold Control, and it'll allow you to deselect the objects that you would like. So that's kind of your different ways of selecting. And we'll go back to these toolbars on the left here. So since we covered points, we're going to go to lines. As you can see, if you hit the drop-down menu, you can do a single line, which is just a line between 2 points. You can also change the way that line is drawn by clicking on these tabs here. So if I did both sides, you can see that it's now drawing that line from both sides. Another thing to note is if you want to get precision in where you're drawing these lines, you can utilize that command bar and you can start to type in its coordinates. As you can see there, I typed in 0, 0, 0. So it's starting at the origin point on this plane. And if I typed in 10, 0, 0, that line has been moved 10 in the X direction, 0 in the Y direction, and 0 in the Z direction. So I'm going to just start that again at 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to draw the next one at 10, 10, 10. And spacebar to end the command. As you can see, that line was drawn 10 in the X, 10 in the Y, and 10 in the Z. So if you go into this further, you can do a polyline, and that is a line built on a collection of points. And if you type in C, as you can see up here, there's an underlined letter in this kind of prompt here. And if you type in that letter, it'll perform that prompt. So I just typed in C there, which for close, and it closed that object. So that's kind of how to draw just your simple 2D lines. Going into our curves, this is a control point curve. So it assumes that arc of the curve based on these control points. Now you have a circle, you could do, unique shapes, kind of like a wetland bog type thing. So that's your points there. And as you can see, if you select them, they don't show their control points. If you go to this icon here, you can show your object control points, which will show you kind of the points that build up that curve. If you wanted to manipulate that curve, you could click on one of these points and you can manipulate it using gumball, or you could manipulate it using the move command. So if I select these, turn my control points on, I type in move, select objects. I'm going to move this point from here, really anywhere. And as you can see, it's snapping to the various points of my other shape. That's a good way to manipulate your 2D curves. If you wanted to turn these curves off, you can go ahead and points off is the right, and now you can turn those points off. If you click this icon, it'll actually show those points on your shape. And it's another way to edit those shapes. There's a ton of other tools here that I'm not going to get into now, but I would encourage you all to just open the program and play around through this, because there's a number of cool things you can do. I mean, helix, you can start the axis, and then you can start to draw helixes. So I would encourage you all to kind of explore some of these tools. The next thing that we're going to cover is circles. So there's plenty of ways to draw circles in Rhino. Circle from center to radius. Here's a circle from diameter, circle from 3 points. So we'll just do a curve from a radius now. And as you can see, select that midpoint and then just assign a radius. I'm going to type in 20. And you'll know that that is a circle with a radius of 20 or a diameter of 40. The way you can check that is you can type in distance. And as you can see, your O-snaps will allow you to pick these various points. And that distance just came up in our command line, and it's 40 feet. So it's a good way to check, just a good way to measure things. If you wanted to change your units, I did mention that this was in feet. You can just type in units and it'll take you to your document properties. This can be changed to metric, imperial. You can even, you can change it to fractional if you were doing some architectural layouts. But I usually keep it in decimal with a display precision of 100 or 100th. If you wanted to get really technical, you could add more decimal points, but or fractions, sorry, but for now, we're just going to keep it to feet. So those are kind of your units. Here's the ellipse tool. It says enter your starting point, enter your first axis, and then enter your second axis. So that's a good way of drawing ellipses. You can do it from diameter. So there's multiple ways to draw those ellipses. Arcs, you can do arcs by clicking the center, clicking the start, and then clicking the other angle. You could do an arc from the start, end, and middle. So here's ways that you can draw arcs. And then here's rectangles right next to the arcs. If you drop down, there's multiple ways to draw rectangles, but we'll just do from corner to corner. So you can just pick a start point, pick an end point. If you wanted to get precise, you could start this at 0, 0, 0, and you could make it 20 in the X direction and 50 in the Y direction. So that's a good way to draw precise 2D rectangles. Furthermore, there's polygons. This allows you to draw different polygons based on number of sides. So right now you can click that prompt. I'm going to change this to 6. As you can see, it's a 6-sided polygon. If I change that to 12, you can see it's now a 12-sided polygon. So that's helpful in that, and when you're trying to draw, octagons, etc. Another cool thing to note is you can do stars, and you can change the number of sides. So if I made this 100, it's now a star with 100 sides, and you can start to draw kind of these complex star shapes. And then there's a series of curve modification tools. I'm going to get into a couple of them now. And a lot of these are familiar with, if you're familiar with AutoCAD, you'll be familiar with a lot of these, such as offset, fillet, trim, extend. So I'll just show you how that works now with some just generic rectangles. So if I type in trim, it'll say select cutting objects. I'm just going to select everything. And then it says select object to trim. As you can see, you can start to trim these lines. A cool thing to note is that you can utilize these other viewports in doing those functions. So if I'm just going to make just a generic 3D box, you can see it in the side view. And if I wanted to trim from the front, I can draw a polyline in the front viewport, type in trim, and then you can trim that box from the front viewport. It's pretty handy tool in that regard. So just for some more kind of 2D editing, we'll go ahead and just show you a couple more. So here we just did trim. We'll just do trim again, just to get some stuff that we can extend. And then you can type in enter to end the command, and then you can type in extend, and it'll say select boundary objects, select curves to extend, and then you can start to extend these curves. One thing to note is that if you have stuff selected and you type in a command, such as trim, it will assume that you know the first prompt in the command, and it'll allow you to bypass that first prompt. Some other tools I use a lot are join. So if I have two lines that aren't connected, you can type in, you can select them both and type in join. And as you can see, two curves were joined into one open curve. Or I'm just going to undo, or you can type in join and select these objects to join. Now they are one closed. If you type in explode, they become separate line segments, much like AutoCAD. So I'm just gonna kind of show a couple more tools here. So if I do a box, fillet I find useful, very similar to CAD. If you type in the fillet, you can select a radius up here at the top. I'm going to type in 20, and it'll say select first curve, select second curve. As you can see, it filleted that curve to a 20-degree radius. Another thing I like to do is I'm just going to draw a line from 0, 0. If you hold shift, it will restrict your cursor to 90 degrees. And I'm going to type in 100, and I am going to click to make that line 100, holding shift in the Y direction. And if you press spacebar or enter, it will end that command. When you have a line like this, you can go ahead and offset, much like CAD. I'm going to offset by 20, offset by 8, offset by 10. And this is, you can just set that by typing it in. And then offset by 8. So that's just a way of offsetting lines. So that kind of covers our basic curve tools. And we're going to go ahead and explore some of the surface tools. So if you click this icon here, here's your surface from 3 or 4 kind of corner points. You can also click this drop-down menu, and you can access a lot of these surface curves that we'll kind of dive into in more detail in the future. But let's just go ahead and make a surface from 3 or 4 points. So I'm going to click that and then just press 4 times. And as you can see, you have a surface from 4 points. If you wanted to see the control points, it's the same thing with the curves. You can show object control points. And by clicking these, you can manipulate that surface. I'm just going to undo this twice. Another trick I like to do a lot is, since there's only 4 control points on the surface, you can actually rebuild this so it's a little bit more complex, and there's more places to adjust that geometry. So I'm just going to go ahead and type in a rebuild, and you can do this with a curve or a surface. And I'm going to select this surface here, and you'll get a pop-up that allows you to adjust kind of the complexity. So initially this was a 4-column grid, but if I do rebuild, you can make this into 12, and you can see that grid spacing is getting smaller. I'm just going to go ahead and keep it at 8. Okay, and you can see it's cut up into a kind of a denser grid. And if you turn your control points on there, you can start to see how the surface has become a little bit more complex, and you can adjust with these control points. Remember, left click to turn those points on, and right click to turn those points off. So that's kind of one of your surfaces. A tool I use a lot is this one here, surface from planar curves. So that's a planar means it's on a 2D plane. So I'm just going to draw kind of a unique circle shape here. I'm going to click surface from planar curves, and it says select planar curves to build surface. And now you have a surface from that 2D curve. There's a ton of other things I utilize in this, this panel, such as surface from network curves. So that means the curves are not planar, and I'm just going to show you how that works. So if you go into your front view and just start drawing a line, you'll see that that is not a 2D curve. I'm going to Command C, Command V, which is copy and paste, and just move that curve out to another location. And then from here, you can see that working in these 4 windows becomes pretty helpful, because I'm selecting that point in the 3D view. I'm going over to the right view, which is restricting it in that right. And then you can close that in your 3D view. I'm going to do the same thing here. And now you have kind of a network of curves. So if you click this command, surface from network of curves, it says select curves in network, and it allows you to build that surface from non-2D curves. Another one of these I use a lot is loft. So I will just take my circle tool, and I'm just going to draw three circles, random geometries. I'm just going to move these up a little bit, and then I'm going to deselect the middle one, move this up more, and then you kind of have this base-like shape. You go back into your surface tools and click loft, select curves to loft. And then it says drag seam point. So you really want these seam points to be coming kind of from the same point and the same angle. I'll show you why in a second, but if you just click enter, you can see that it just developed that shape from the network of curves. So if you go back to that presentation we had, that was the blue lines in that planter base. If you run that command again, just by selecting all of them and pressing enter and flipping one of these, you can see that the loft has reversed that top kind of sweep and caused it to make a, interesting object. The last one I'm going to share with you on this, I guess I got a couple more, but one I use a ton, and I use this a lot for topography, is patch. And I say I use it for topography, but I use it for topography only if we're in a conceptual phase, because it's really not that accurate. And I can show you why in a sec. But we'll just draw some of these imaginary topo in our top view. Start to drag these up. And if I run the patch command, you can select your curves. And then you can adjust this. So this is your XY grid on the U and V spans. Stiffness and sample point spacing I'm not going to get into, but I would highly suggest that you utilize a tutorial to kind of understand this command. It's super helpful. I use it a ton. But I'm just going to click OK. And as you can see, it kind of generically made a surface from those curves. I do that again, and I simplify this. As you can see, my object got very kind of more interpolated from these networks of curves. So those are some of your surface tools. I'm going to dive into this here, this kind of generic volumes. So, you know, you can make a box just by doing corner, corner, corner. You can do cylinders from center radius up. You know, you could do a cone, so base of cone, radius, end of cone. So you can have a series of shapes. You can do this with your spheres. So here's a, you know, just tons of ways you can make kind of pre-made simple geometries. One thing that I'll share here, actually, in the previous toolbar is there's a couple more that I want to cover. So sweep one and extrude along a curve, or extrude straight are good. So if you have a 2D object and you want to make it a 3D object, you can just type in extrude straight or click that icon and it'll extrude that curve. I usually just type it in. You can extrude curve, click enter. You can make it both sides. You can make it solid, which makes it a volume. If you type in volume, you could begin to see what that volume is in this command bar here. So that's how you can kind of extrude, much like the push and pull in SketchUp. You can also do that with surfaces. So I'm just going to make a surface from 4 points using this here. And I'm going to type in extrude surf, extrude SRF. And you can select which surface to extrude. And it's much like the push and pull in SketchUp. So there's a couple more cool things you can do with these surface tools. I'm going to just snap to this center and then find an endpoint here and go into my 2D view. I'm going to draw just a random curve going up in the Z direction. There's also a cool thing you could do with Gumball is if you click this kind of 90-degree arc, it allows you to rotate. So I'm going to type in 90 and it allowed that object to be rotated in the 90-degree angle. And I'm just going to snap that to an intersection on this circle. So now you have this kind of like the Little Dipper type of thing going on with a handle and a circle. You can do this cool thing called extrude along curve. So I'm going to click that point, select curve to extrude, press enter, select path curve near start. So I'm going to select that near the start. As you can see, it took that curve and then extruded it along that other curve. Another way to do that is a command I use a lot. It's called sweep one, which if you go to your surface tools, sweep one rail. So it says select rail, which is what you want to flow that curve onto. And then you can select your sweep shapes, select your direction. And as you can see, it took that circle and swept it along that curve. Another cool thing to note is that if this curve, I'm going to Command C, Command V, and move it here. I'm going to move it in the 90 degrees. I'm just going to pick an endpoint here. You can actually change the size of this. So like I showed you earlier in Gumball, I'm going to click this bottom scale here and type in 2. So as you can see, it just got 2 larger in the Y direction. I'm going to move this point to this end. And if you run your sweep again, sweep one, you can select your rail, which is what you want to flow these objects along. And then you can select your shapes. And then, as you can see, that circle has now been swept into a more complex geometry. And if you wanted to make this a solid, you can go ahead and cap it like so. And now if you type in volume, you can see that it has an associated volume. Or it's right now, there's no thickness to this object. If you typed in offset surf, you can select which surfaces you want to offset. So it's going to offset them this direction, which is inward. And I'm going to make this distance 20 for 20 feet. And it took that surface and it offset the outside to the inside by 20 feet. So now, for all you dog lovers, it's like a bison horn that you give your dog as a treat. You know, it's got some volume and some mass to it. And you can also run that volume command and you can see that it's a closed object. So those are some neat tools that I always use to make surfaces. The last thing I'm going to touch on, kind of to go over these, are the Boolean tools. If you're familiar with Adobe Illustrator, it's very similar to the Pathfinder tools. So I'm just going to kind of move these arbitrarily next to each other just to kind of show how this works. But if you click just on Boolean union, you can select these two objects, and now they have been unioned into one object from the area of intersection. If you click this drop-down menu and do difference, it says select surfaces or poly surfaces to subtract from, and then you press enter, and then select surfaces or poly surfaces to subtract with. You can press enter, and as you can see, it subtracted that square volume from this sphere volume. You can also do others where you can get the intersection. So select the first, select the second, and it'll give you the intersection of those two objects. So that's a very quick exploration into the Boolean tools. And again, a lot of these are join, explode, trim, split, you know, group. Group's pretty cool. I use that a lot. I'll go ahead and just select these objects, type in group. Now they're all one object that you can move. You know, you can ungroup. You can make these things into blocks. If you wanted to make a block, type in block, select objects. Select whatever point you wanted as a base point. We'll do the center. We'll call it sphere. And then you can, you know, start to populate with blocks. And if you wanted to change them, you can click in. You can add object. And I'm just going to make another sphere next to it. So I'm going to go add object, actually, just kidding. So as you can see, by adding that sphere, all the other block definitions changed. It's great when you're adding in, you know, 10 of the same objects, and if they change, then you can easily update them all at once. But I would just encourage you to go through some of these. You know, I'll just do there's text, there's 3D text. So, you know, say you're working on a project and there's a little plaque where you're, or a piece of concrete that you're gonna do a leave out for text. You can just go ahead and use that text command. Hi, my name is Adam. I'm gonna make this 10. And I'm going to put it here on this face. Oops. Okay, move it here. All right, so if you get to here and you're like, oh, it's not big enough, there's a bunch of cool ways you can scale. So you can scale just generically and it'll scale everything all at once. You can do scale 2D. So you can select an object and then you can scale in 2 dimensions, which I will, do that. Or you can scale 1D, which allows you to select an object and just scale in 1 dimension. I use scale 1D all the time. I'm a huge fan of it. All right, so let's just make sure all this text gets on. We'll dive into some of these layer properties now. So since these are all on the default layer, which you can see here in the bottom, their display color is black. I'm gonna go ahead and just change this layer, this object to a different layer. So you can do that by right clicking and change object layer. And as you can see, it just moved onto the red layer. You can hide it, you can lock it. So it's a good way to change layers. You can also do that from down here. So if you click this layer, display layer, you can just click a different layer and it'll go to that layer. So there's multiple ways to change your layer there, but I'm just gonna go ahead and make that locked so I can't select it. And I'm gonna select my text and extrude these by 10. So now you have some extruded text. I'm gonna take this, move it down, arbitrary amount, and then you can start to utilize the tools that we just went over. So if we do Boolean difference, select surfaces or poly surfaces to subtract from. I want to cut out this text into this block. So I'm gonna click that. And then select surfaces or poly surfaces to subtract with. I'm gonna go ahead and just right click and then you can do select objects and it'll select all objects on that layer. Click enter. And as you can see, it just cut out that text into this shape. So I'm gonna double click into this window here to kind of go over some materials. Rhino is great because you can actually do some rendering in the model. You can do that by clicking, so you don't have to take it to Lumion or Enscape. You can kind of just get a quick representation through Rhino, through its rendering software. So I'm just going to go ahead and click materials, which are generically assigned by layer. I'm going to go to use new material, import from materials library. And then I'm going to go architectural, wall, concrete. I'm going to just click concrete light. Okay, and now that material has been set to my layer 0, 1. If I drop this down and go to rendered, you can see that it's taken on a concrete texture. A way to change the scale of that texture is if you go into concrete, you can click textures, color, concrete light, and it comes in with a size. So right now it's 2. I'm going to make it 20. Click enter, enter. And as you can see, that texture just mapped a little bit larger. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the rendering. But those are just ways you can start to use the Boolean tools in your designs. So I've got a series of exercises that we'll see how many we get to in the next 20 minutes, but we'll just kind of build off of the tools that we utilized earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a line at 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to make it 100 feet long. And I'm going to hold shift in the Y direction, sorry, to get a line. I'm going to select the line, type offset. I'm going to offset that by 20. I'm going to offset this by 8. I'm going to offset this by 10. I'm going to offset this by 6. Offset by 0.5 or half a foot. So then I'm going to go ahead, draw a line, draw to this endpoint, and then I'm going to make this 11. So that just kind of gives you like a line adjacent. A trick that I use a lot is mirror. So MIRR, select objects, select all these lines, click mirror, start of the mirror plane, end of the mirror plane. So as you can see, I have these lines kind of just mirrored directly adjacent to each other. I'm going to go and just double click on a different layer. So as you can see, it'll change the layer that I'm working with. And I'm going to make a surface from 4 points utilizing those lines I just drew. So now you have a surface, you have all these lines. If I wanted each of these to be their own surfaces, so just to be split, you can type in split. A lot of this stuff is intuitive. If you think of a command or something you want to do, try to type it into the Rhinoceros command lines, because more often than not, it'll work. So I am going to select this to split with these cutting objects. Now, as you can see, now these are all different segments. What you can do from there is start selecting some of these, putting them on different layers. I'm gonna go ahead and make this layer organic grass, make it grass dark, okay. And then I'm gonna make this layer import from materials library, architectural exterior streets, hardscape, street asphalt. Okay, I'm going to change this to that. Right, so you can kind of see what I'm doing from this here. I'm changing these materials, and then you can start to see these sections. This could be, utilized as a good way to do a road section. As you can see, everything is on kind of your base plane here, so you can go ahead and drop this down, 6 inches. Minus 6 inches, right, to get your curb. There, I'm gonna just exaggerate it. Oh, there we go, so that starts to drop the road grade. You can select these lines on your concrete layer, extrude curve, like we discussed earlier. You could extrude those down to your road grade. Now you have kind of your curve there, your roadway. It looks like the texture is mapping pretty small. So again, you can go into that by clicking on the material itself, clicking on street asphalt, going to size and upping that size, just upped it to 10 from 2, and it's starting to look a little better. We'll do the same thing with the grasses. So change that to 10. All right, and now you can see it's really starting to come together as like a 2D or a 3D representation of like a section cut. So that's pretty neat. Go back to shaded. If you wanted to get more in depth and like put your roadway markings in, you can do the same, offset by 0.33, which is like 4 inches. Do the same. So now you can see you can split those. You can split that surface with these lines. Now you have different surfaces. Another trick I like to use is, say these lines weren't directly on this object. say they were floating above, but you wanted to split that object with these lines, you can type in project, select these curves, select curves and points to project, press enter when done, select surfaces, polysurfaces, etc. to project onto. So you do this in the top view, and it'll take those curves and it will project them onto that surface. So again, we can utilize our split tool. Go ahead and make this a new material. I'm just gonna use paint, make it yellow. And then if you go back to your rendered view, you can start to see how this gets a little bit more definition. You know, if these were bike lanes, you could put this on another layer. It generically renders white. So if you go here, pick a new material. I'm just going to make this green, like many bike lanes are. Then you can start to see how this becomes a really powerful representational tool when you're talking with clients, when you're talking with your internal teams, etc. So that's just splitting, projecting. Another thing to note is, you know, say you wanted to get the perimeter of this object. I use this command all the time. It's called duplicate face border. So it allows you to select a surface and you can pick the border from that surface. It also allows you to do it with non-planar curves. So if we just draw 3D curves and we loft those to get a 3D surface, you can see that it's in 3D. You can utilize this command to get those curves from that surface. I find that tool to be super helpful. The next thing we can cover is the revolve command. So like this example, we'll just do them both. So if you're working in your front, you can go ahead and just make a curve. If you type in revolve, select curves, select start axis, select end axis, and then if you click full circle, you can see that it revolved that red dash line around a 360-degree circle to get you kind of like this unique planter pot. You could also do that by loft. So you can start with those blue curves that I shared earlier. And you could start to pull some of these up. Type in loft. And now you have a pot utilizing the plan view curves as opposed to that section cut. Again, offset surf will allow you to give some thickness to these things. You can flip which way you want it to extrude. So it's going to go on the inner. I'm going to do it by 20. Too big. Distance 5. Distance 2. And as you can see, it offset that to be a volume. So I use that command a ton. So I had several other, I'll do a couple more really quick, but here's some that I use a ton. So I'm just going to draw a line here in the perspective view. And I'm just going to make a sphere here, you know, in the 2D view. Array is very similar to CAD. So if you type in array, select objects, that will allow you to just array in the X, Y, and Z dimension. And then you can do the spacing and you can see kind of what that looks like. Or you could type an array. And as you can see, when you type in a command, it gives you a drop down of commands that it could make with what you've typed in, which is super cool. So I'm going to do array curve. So it's select objects, select path. I'm going to make this 30 items. And as you can see, this could be very useful at designing a railing, a fence, maybe a folly. If you're familiar with DIA, that windscreen, you can do these things, you know, kind of on an angle. So I'm gonna just make a generic kind of shape here. Using gumball, I'm gonna rotate that shape 45 degrees, actually -10. And then move that from its midpoint to the end point. And I'm going to array curve, select objects, select path curve. And as you can see, it's arraying those along the curve in a free-formed way. You can tighten that up by doing no rotation, and it'll just have them all go in that direction. So that's another command I use a ton. And the last thing I'm going to share is ways you can start to modify surfaces using contours. And I find this to be one of my favorite things to do in Rhino, is utilizing the contour command. So right now in the right view, I'm just going to generically draw some shapes. I'm going to take these shapes and just kind of arbitrarily move them. And then I'm going to utilize the loft command to make a surface between these three curves. So if I type in loft, oops. There we go. Loft it's pretty key and critical in loft that you start from one end to the other in your selection, because if you go from end to end to end, it occasionally will mess it up. But in this case, it didn't. But we'll just go ahead and loft this shape. You know, say you're exploring some forms of abstracted kind of, you know, unique geometries, and your client's really into biophilia, and this is, you know, an abstracted hummingbird's belly. You could, you know, go ahead and say you're going to make a cool pavilion out of this form. You can always add new layers here. You can also add sub layers, but you know, I'm just going to add a couple more layers. You can change the color of these layers for display purposes, so you know what you're selecting. And I'm just going to hop on layer 6 and type in contour. Select an object, select base plane point, select perpendicular point, distance between contours 5. So I'm going to do that like this, and then you get this. It contours that surface based on the interval of your choice. Another command I like to use is extract iso curve, which allows you to extract curves from a poly surface. So I'm just going to generically pick some points or pick some curves along the surface to extract from. do. So right now I'm going to hide that, and now you can see, I'm going to pop into here that you have this like kind of ribbed structure and some stuff hanging off the edge. This is nice to utilize your 4 viewpoints. You can type in trim in the top view, select all of these objects, and it'll trim from that top view. So once you have this, it's starting to look like the exoskeleton of something. You can go ahead and select it all just by going like this, or you can hold Shift, select the layers you want to select, right click, select objects, and it'll select those. So what I'm going to do now is go on to a new layer, which I've made to polished metal, type in pipe, set that pipe diameter to 0.5, and it took all those 2D lines and made them into 3D pipes. So now, if you go to your rendered view, you've got this sweet, amorphous shade structure that could be included in one of your projects. So, got a couple more, and I'll just do one last one with the sake of time. So say you're working for like a genetics company and they're like, hey, we want this mound, with a helix on it because we're dealing with DNA. You can say, all right, model that for you. And you can do that by generically making some topography using the patch command like we discussed earlier. Select your points. I'm going to put this on the grass layer. All right, so now you have your mound in rendered. Go back to shaded. So then, like I shared earlier with the curve tools, you can start to utilize these, right? I'm going to do a helix. I'm going to do start of axis, end of axis. Right, so now you can see if you Command C, Command V to copy and paste, and you move that 90 degrees, you move that 180 degrees, you can start to see how that's your double helix here. You can go ahead and loft to get a surface between these two helixes, which is this right here. And then you can go ahead and contour that surface using this base point, this perpendicular direction, and I'm going to make it a distance of 3. So now you have your center of your helix. You can delete that. Select your 2 outside of strands, type in pipe, make that a diameter of 1. And I'm going to do that on the default layer. And then you can select the center, which I put on layer 6, do pipe, and a diameter of 0.25. And now, if you go to rendered, you can see you got your helix, your 2D helix strand that you can move over into your mound. And then you can say, here's your gateway icon to your new, genetics laboratory. So I know I just threw a ton at you. And I would really recommend going back through this video before the next workshop, just to kind of understand some of these modeling basics. And I know it probably came pretty fast and there was a lot to cover in an hour and a half, but, I would highly just strongly encourage you to come back and, on YouTube, you can slow videos down to 50% of its speed, etc. I would just recommend that, you come back to this with the program open, and watch it at your own pace and follow along, just as you see fit. And I would also highly recommend to utilize YouTube and its tutorials, as well as McNeil. If you just type in McNeil Rhino tutorials, they have a ton on their website that you can utilize at your leisure. They even have some for architecture. So this is just a great resource that you can utilize, as you start to dive into Rhino more.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. I'm just going to do one more final plug before we jump off here. April 4th, make sure you're registered. Adam's going to lead a part 2 of this Rhino session. And Michelle, I think we will be able to address your question on why to use Rhino versus SketchUp, for example, for a streetscape section during that time. Thank you all for joining. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to prepare for this session and for taking the time to facilitate the session. We look forward to seeing everyone next time. Thank you.